Hello, I'm Rose Jackson, the Director of the Democracy and Tech Initiative at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, and I'm excited to welcome you to this year's 360 StratCom. On the 60th anniversary of the Atlantic Charter, it's fitting that we recommit ourselves to the values and urgency of democracy and human rights as a foundational element of healthy, prosperous, and secure societies. 360 StratCom is held this year on the margins of the Biden administration's Summit for Democracy, an engagement that's bringing together government leaders from around the world to create an affirmative agenda for democracy renewal and tackle the greatest threats faced by democracies. The summit presents a timely opportunity to drive progress on the most urgent issues facing the free world. That's why we're honored to host so many leaders in this space as this exciting week kicks off. Over the course of the next 3 days, you'll hear from government officials from allied countries, civil society leaders, and industry reps on everything from digital policy and tech governance to accountable information ecosystems, and what it means to be proactively democratic in a hyper-connected world. We're also thrilled to be joined by our other Atlantic Council colleagues from the Council's China Hub, the Democratic Order Initiative, and the Geoeconomics and Geotech Centers to bring you conversations that build on the 3 pillars of the Summit for Democracy: defending against authoritarianism, addressing and fighting corruption, and promoting respect for human rights. I encourage you to visit the StratCom webpage to see the entire agenda and sign up for the next 3 days of exciting programming. Throughout the conference, we encourage you to participate, comment, and share on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at our handle DFRLab, and to use the hashtag 360StratCom to stay up to date. And with that, I'm excited to pass you over to Graham Brookie, Senior Director of the DFR Lab, to kick off the first panel of StratCom, the right to information. Graham?
Thank you so much, Rose. I'm honored to kick off 360 StratCom this year with a panel discussing the right to information. Now, freedom of expression and a right to information are not always the same thing and requires a really large balancing act. So there is a balancing of rights between them that is core to democracy. How do we ensure someone's right to express themselves doesn't infringe someone else's ability to access information core to their own rights, like accessing information about elections or public health? The question made obvious by the title of this session is, given the scale and scope of the internet today, and the general consensus that we face an urgent crisis of information integrity, do we need a clearly, or how can we better articulate and enforce a right to information? That's the core question that we're discussing today with our 3 distinguished panelists who I'm honored to introduce. First and foremost, Barbara Bukowska is the Senior Director for Law and Policy at Article 19, an international organization working for the freedom of expression for all people. Barbara leads on the development of all Article 19 policies and work and provides legal oversight and support for their legal work across the organization. Second, we have Nanjala Nyabola, who is currently the Director of AdVox, a digital rights program at Global Voices, and is a practitioner in residence of the Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative at University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. And third, we have Catherine Maher, who is the former Chief Executive Officer and Executive Director of the Wikimedia Foundation, who oversaw the operations of the organization and its professional staff, and is now a Senior Non-Resident Fellow with the DFR Lab. So thank you all. It's great to be here with you all. First and foremost, in general, we think a lot about what we're against in this space, right? We think a lot about what to do about mis and disinformation. We think a lot about what to do about online harms, and at least less so for especially this audience, we think about what we're actually for. And so a brief anecdote to begin this discussion. The freedom of information was actually articulated in one of the speeches that founded the Atlantic Council. It was the 4 Freedom speech that the FDR gave, which in the editing process, he had articulated a very, very robust freedom of information. And then in the editing process, they edited it back to something that he thought Americans would understand a little bit better: freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And then 4 Freedom speech became the documents that founded the Atlantic Charter, one of our founding documents here at the Atlantic Council, and is now articulated in various UN documentation. And so the first question is over to Barbara. What is the state of play with the freedom of information, both online and around the world? How is it going? Is it robust? Is it achieved? What are the pitfalls that we're looking at here?
Yeah, thank you, Graham, and thank you so much, Atlantic Council, for inviting me for this very important discussion. And I really like that you are starting this conference with emphasis on right to information, because right to information really underpins our democracy. It underpins what responsible government should be doing, and actually shows that transparency and accountability of the government is really the baseline for the right to freedom of expression. And I was actually quite surprised that you said that right to information and freedom of expression should be in conflict sometimes, or we would have to balance them, because in our work as international free speech organization, we really see them as a part of the same coin, right to information being integral part of the freedom of expression, of the right to freedom of expression. And the international human rights framework, which underpins our work, it is really understood as a right of people, as individuals, to seek transparency from their governments, to get access to information that governments hold about them, for them, and the information on which basis the governments make decisions. And then empowered by this information, the individuals can make their governments accountable for those decisions and see what the governments are up to. And obviously on internet, this is being more and more challenged, because governments are no longer those who are actually controllers of the information in the sense of information they hold about people. And more we see corporations, especially big tech, making decisions on the basis which we don't know about, right? We don't know on what basis they make information accessible to us, or what basis they make their content moderation decisions. So I think that, and you mentioned the origins with the Atlantic Council, but also I want to go back to the origins of international human rights law, which was designed to limit the abuses of power and make those who are the most powerful in the society accountable to the people. So that's why now with the internet and different gatekeepers and power brokers, especially big tech, we need to really see how we can apply these right to information obligations on the entities beyond the governments. But also going back to what you said before, that we often look at negatives. We look at disinformation online or all the social ills which currently are being discussed in relation to internet. But we also need to see how internet empowers people and how right to information empowers people to seek access to information about health, access to information which is necessary for sustainable development and many, many aspects of life, and really go back to the basis which international human rights framework provides us with to apply this right far more broadly than necessarily just in the state legislation.
Thank you so much for that. Nanjala, when we were preparing for this conversation, you said something that struck out. Your work in the digital space and how human rights law extends or does not extend into the digital space. A lot of the human rights framework that Barbara just alluded to or touched on in an extraordinarily comprehensive way for a 2-minute rundown, you've talked a lot about how those frameworks have been domesticated or incorporated into national legal frameworks. But that doesn't always mean that they are implemented, enforced, respected. So what is the difference there, and how does that especially get exacerbated in the online space?
Yes, so just to build off of what Barbara said, it's important to think about, it just goes to the fundamentals of governance, right? That, the public sphere is basically a conversation between citizens and their government and other entities that are present in the public sphere. So civil society, corporations, and all of that. And your right to information basically recognizes that as existing in a society, when you exist in a society, you generate information, you create data, you have a birth certificate, you have a passport, you have an ID, you produce information, data just by virtue of your existence. And it's basically saying that you have a right as part of being of that public sphere and being in that conversation to have it's like a multilateral conversation, that it's not just that you produce information and the government or the corporations take that information and run with it, but you as a citizen, because it's a two-way thing, it's a conversation, have a right to know what information is produced about you, how it is disseminated, how it is processed, what happens to it after you generate it, to demand that it is handled with respect to your rights and your dignity, and to demand that it's processed in a very specific, transparent way so that you can say, well, that information isn't being handled in a way that is respectful to me, and et cetera. And this is really where the governance gap becomes really evident, because the right to information as contained in international human rights instruments, and especially in this case, I'm thinking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is domesticated in almost all countries in the world. It's one of the most widely ratified international instruments in the world. It's the implementation gap that really we start to see these issues that require subsidiary legislation and activism and organizing, and even the presence of corporations, because we have to remember that a big part of our digital lives right now is not being mediated by governments, it's being mediated by corporations, that the people who are collecting, processing, handling that information are no longer people that we elect or people that we hold accountable through, other processes, but are people that see us not as citizens, but as consumers and as users. And there's a rights conversation that happens there. There's a shift that happens there that's really important to pay attention to. When you're thinking about the right to information in civic discourse, that is in relation to governments and governance and things like that, there's a balance of power that, as Barbara talked about, and as you talked about, when people were coming up with all of these international instruments, there was a imbalance of power that they were trying to redress, where they saw, maybe if governments have way too much power to know and citizens don't have any power to demand that transparency and the knowing, then it creates opportunities for authoritarianism. If the government holds all the cards and has all the information, and the citizen has no power to say, hey, how do you know where I live? How do you know how much money I spent in electricity last month? There's an imbalance there that needs to be redressed. That imbalance exists in the digital space, but now we're talking about an imbalance between individuals and corporations, especially, and individuals and other individuals, right? And because we're no longer having that mediation through statehood. And this is one of the big challenges for those of us who work in the digital rights space. How do we articulate a conversation about these rights that recognizes that the key players in this space are not necessarily states or civic bodies, local councils and governments that we have instruments and institutions to deal with, but now are corporations who are keen on excluding themselves, or who have, because of the way in which the internet has evolved and this tech utopianism, have excluded themselves from some of these rights and obligations that exist in the analog space. And that's one of the key regulatory, it's one of the key policy conversations that I think people need to be paying attention to. What does a rights discourse look like in the digital age, considering who the players are?
Well, and it's a really good point. You touch on, it used to be a two-way street, right? It used to be a citizen and a government, and information in between, and how that information was balanced, controlled, disseminated, kept private, et cetera, how those rights were respected. And now basically you have that two-way relationship with thousands and thousands and thousands of entities, right? Data going in every single direction, information about people going in every single direction, both generated by those people, but also taken from those people. So, in the early days of the internet, we just kind of assumed, or the assumption was that it would be uniformly a force for good, that it would be an education tool, a communications tool. And now looking at the internet today, we know that hasn't quite worked out as expected, as intended. We could insert a Web3 joke, but I'm sure that'll happen throughout the rest of the summit. So, Catherine, one of the concepts that you talk a lot about is the sum of all knowledge. And how has the internet both increased the sum of all knowledge? How has it actually expanded the access to information? Because it's not all a bad news story, to be clear. But also, where has the internet fallen short of that primary ideal, or that original ideal?
Sure. So just making sure I caught your question. I think it's really interesting to think about what you just started off with, Graham, this idea that the internet was created at a time in which there was the sort of term we often use is techno-optimism, this idea that more internet means more better, right? The more internet that we have, the more connectivity that we have, clearly that is going to create a net gain for society. And so therefore, we should just sort of let the internet continue to grow without really thinking about how one might apply some of the checks or balances that have evolved in the offline space at the time when we really saw these two as very distinct realms of participation and engagement. Clearly, at this point in our lives, or I think arguably at this point in our lives, the internet is not a distinct sphere relative to society. It is deeply embedded in all sorts of parts of our lives, from education to commercial transactions to political participation, and in the sort of primary distinction between sort of the offline and online space is not so much how much time we spend upon it or the real harms or the real benefits, but the scale of the network. And one of the things that I often think about in the context of these conversations around the right to expression or the right to privacy or the right to information is really what norms have evolved in the time that we have been online. So 20 to 30 years, sort of depending on who you are and what access you have. What norms have evolved to regulate a space that brings us together at a connected scale that is really unprecedented in the world. That at the time at which we discussed the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, which establishes the right to freedom of expression and freedom of information, we were not dealing with the same level of connectivity that we currently are today. In fact, most of the norms that we use to govern what our expectations are about reasonable privacy and reasonable speech and the boundaries of our rights versus the rights of the community really emerged from a time that dealt with much smaller sort of cohorts or sizes of individual communities that had the capacity to govern themselves perhaps more effectively within more homogeneous contexts than the sort of tremendous heterogeneity of a network with the edges of about 3 to 4 billion people. And so I think that's one of the sort of primary issues that we have in talking about what kind of environment that we want to be in, whether from a right to information or a right to expression or any of these other sort of rights that we often talk about in the context of the internet. Is we simply don't know necessarily what it is that we want when we're connected at this sort of scale. And I think that does really, and it should really inform the kind of conversations that we're having around some of these rights, not just in terms of the political rights that have previously been discussed by our other panelists around the right to participation in the political landscape, the right to access to information from the governments that we consent to be governed by, but also some of the rights around certainly our civil rights around protections such as privacy, as I've mentioned, but also our cultural rights, such as the right to education or representation or creativity, and even some of the commercial rights that are available to us as creators and innovators and people seeking livelihoods. And so I really look at this as a very broad sort of the right to information, and not simply being a political discourse, but also being a discourse around what is represented, what services exist. I think, circling back to your question, yes, it is not all bad news. It has been a tremendous expansion of access to information that previously did not exist. And when I think about that, it's not simply, as I said, these access to political information. The 90s and 2000s saw a wave of efforts where the internet really drove a sort of a trend around open government and citizen access, which is really useful in certain contexts around transparency and accountability, but also had some limitations, which I'm sure we can talk about. But what I think we often miss the picture of is how much flourishing there has been of cultural representation, of individual representation, of groups that previously were often excluded from having their stories represented, their cultural history represented on not just online, because clearly the internet didn't exist previously, but in the mainstream discourse around identity, around power, at the level of really being able to influence and shape the way we see each other and in the ways in which we engage in questions of governance, trade, and the like. And so I think that as we look at the internet, yes, it is still dominated largely by European languages, but some of the fastest growing participation online comes from what has historically sort of been referred to as the global South, where that if you look at the sort of differentiators between the global north and the global south, the areas where the internet has been widely accessible for the last 20 to 30 years have really become sort of saturated in terms of access to information, access to connectivity, access to high bandwidth, and the production of information in those languages. The sort of rate of creation in those languages has tended to sort of flatline over time and is really much more incremental. Whereas if we look to the so-called global south, where we actually see there's a tremendous opportunity space for representation of communities that have not had their native languages online, that have not necessarily been able to create in those languages or create among themselves, whether from an educational or an informational or political participation standpoint. And as those areas of the world become more connected and have greater access, we are seeing sort of a concomitant flourishing as well. And I think that that's really where some of the more exciting conversations are, perhaps sort of in the positive realm, as we look at this question of right to information and seeing that this is a really holistic understanding of the opportunity. Yes, a political one, absolutely, some of these hard dynamics that have already been referenced by Barbara and Nanjala, but also the opportunity to say that flourishing, human flourishing, really does necessitate sort of a holistic understanding of what information and creativity also means.
Well, and it's fairly apparent that the early innovators of the internet, weren't sitting around thinking, I wonder how we can incorporate the UN Declaration of Human Rights into this thing that we're building and innovating on, right? And that's part of the challenge that we're trying to solve for now in reverse. Nanjala, did you have a brief point?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back on that because I always feel like it's important to emphasize the distinction between the internet and the platforms that we use to connect to the internet. Because I think that's really where a lot of these blurred lines sort of come up, because absolutely the existence of the internet has done so much for people finding each other and for people all the wonderful things that Catherine has pointed out that, I've just spent the last year working on a project about Kiswahili translation for digital rights concepts in Kiswahili, and most of it would not have been possible, especially in the context of a pandemic, if we didn't have an internet, if I couldn't get professors from Zanzibar to Zoom in and be in these workshops and things like that. So the challenge is really, how do we maintain that distinction so that we create space for accountability for platforms that, as you just pointed out, Graham, aren't necessarily thinking about all of these things that are crucial to maintaining some kind of civic space online. So thinking about the rights context and the histories and the very specific cultural dynamics that come into play, and keep the integrity of the internet as a platform that allows for all of these types of expression and community building and people finding each other. And the question of scale as well. I think thinking about scale, we zoom in on, well, who is struggling with the scale question? Is it the person who is building a translation network for Zulu translators, to be online and sort of, translate, I don't know, stories, children's stories into Zulu? Or is it the people who are trying to, again, focusing on the commercial advantages of the internet versus thinking about it as a space for civic expression? So I think I absolutely agree with everything that Catherine has said. I think it's just really to underscore that distinction, I think, would also help us sort of parse through some of these umbrella questions that we're having.
Absolutely. And so parsing through the internet versus vehicles that we use to navigate the internet or access the internet, et cetera. And that's an incredibly important distinction. I will also note that I don't think that on any of the, or seldomly at least, on the quarterly earnings calls for a number of the vehicles that we use to access the internet, the terms human rights and democracy come up on a regular basis. So that's an extraordinary tour de force primer on a right to information. So thank you very, very much. I will follow up with a brief question for each of the panelists, the same question, basic question. Is a right to information even possible right now, given the scale and scope of the internet? Are we, going in circles here? What do we need to do? Is a right to information possible today, at scale, globally? And first, I'll kick off to Barbara for that question.
Yeah, I think that we have right to information and we have information on the internet. But I think what you are pointing out is actually slightly different problem than I would like to focus on, because what you are actually talking about is what sort of information we got online, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the key issues we have here is what we call it Article 19, reduce pluralism and reduce diversity online, right? And this is very much basis for a democracy, right? So this pluralism of information is really the what people need for making open discourse, and which allows individuals to form their opinions and engage in society. But thanks to the business model of those companies, with Nigella and Catherine mentioned, the business model doesn't really favor pluralism, right? It does not, despite the infinite abundance of information we have there, it's not everything which you see when you open your social media pages, for instance. Because what you see there, unless you are some of those internet geeks, when you go on Google, instead of going to page 1, you go to like page 5,000, you only see like a sliver of information which the companies decide to profile to you or curate to you based on the algorithm, which is business secret, and we don't know what this algorithm is. And the business model is also based on advertisement and monetization of users' attention, right? So you only get this tiny sliver of what the company is thinking you should see. And moreover, what you see is the content which many studies show is the content which is more engaging, right? And often which is provocative, or also what is sensationalist, or which really appeals to our the basic instincts, or triggers outrage or fear and so on. And often this is what we probably will later talk about, is this information is part of such a content. So we really see, and this is the main problem based on this business model which these companies have, is that we really see less information and less reliable and less plural information out there. And this is actually the problem which we need to address through legislators or through enforcers to protect our democracy, and also to protect social cohesion, or reduce disinformation and increase tolerance in society. And for this, we need right to information in a broader sense than it's understood now in many of those legislators that Nigella talked about, which only covers states. And more the governments and regulators or institutions such as European Union are discussing how to mandate transparency also to the companies. So we'll have a right to see from the companies on what basis they profile information to us or curate content for us. And also which regulators can see and really audit these algorithms and see how they can promote democracy or access to reliable information and so on. So I think that's the problem we are talking about when we are talking about internet. And again, I want to agree that internet is not this like generic blob which sits out there. It's infrastructure, it's the companies, and moreover, it's a handful of companies. It's not a space at the moment where a lot of alternative players can come in and flourish, because the gatekeepers, these big companies, are operating in a way which we really have a digital market failure, which is not conducive to alternative business models where people would get a better information and better experience online.
So we're building knowledge throughout the panel. I'll reframe the question a little bit as we go through the next two panelists. Is it possible to realize a right to information given the scope of the internet? Catherine, one of the things that stuck out in Barbara's answer was pluralistic, or like more people contributing more information to a holistic information environment. You happen to know something a lot about that, given your former role. So how does that work? Does that work? Can you create a marketplace of ideas where people contribute information on a consistent basis in order to realize a right to information that is collective?
Sure, Graham, and there's like two different directions I want to take this answer, but I'll go with the first one, which is sort of where you're leading me to, which is, of course, you're referring to Wikipedia and the fact that Wikipedia exists in 300 different languages and is contributed to and created by tens of millions of people from across the world and read by about 1 billion people every month. And so clearly there is a marketplace for information, and there is even a pluralistic marketplace for information. The challenge is that even within that pluralism, that is still a singular platform. And while it serves an incredibly important purpose as a nonprofit institution that really operates in sort of a public trust, nonetheless, it is a singular institution. And I think what we'd really, I think the panelists here, and certainly from my own perspective, would like to see as an internet that functions a little more like that overall, like the incentives that exist within Wikipedia as a singular platform extended to the scale of the entire internet. I think one of the things that Barbara picked up on, however, is something really worth highlighting, and this is there are different ways. The problem that I'm about to speak to, which is this question of scale, there are different ways that I think regulators and legislators are trying to think about how to this. But functionally speaking, the way that the internet exists today is that you have a competitive advantage the more that you're able to acquire a user base at the lowest possible cost, which is the way that we think. It's how do we actually grow the size of the platform and grow the user base relative to the core product without investing significantly more in order to do so. And what that functionally means is that we're trying to offer sort of the narrowest possible product offering to the largest number of people, which ends up being a really homogenizing experience, both in terms of the sorts of services that are offered, because you don't want to build diversity is expensive, and the content that is offered by the platforms, because the idea is to reduce sort of the overhead and costs of building sort of a differentiated experience for each user. And as long as that remains sort of core business model of the internet with the efficiencies that technology provides, you're always going to find yourself in a model in which relatively homogenous, to use the word again, or non-pluralistic sort of offering, because that tends to be the thing that is most successful with the largest number of users. Now, that doesn't mean that it is most successful for everyone. It just means that the percentage of users that find value in those first 10 search results or in those sort of first 10 clicks on an algorithmic newsfeed is the largest, whether that's 60% or 70% of the users. You're going to end up with a percentage of the users, particularly those who don't sort of conform to that middle, that middle average user, finding themselves without the sort of information or the sort of services or the sort of experiences that they're looking for. And so that challenge of scale, which is really inherent to the business model and is inherent to the consolidation of this highly commercialized understanding of the internet, has made it difficult for us to really think about freedom of information in the context of a marketplace of ideas, because we're not truly presented with an open market, and we're not presented with a market that is tailored and contextualized to difference. It is actually tailored and contextualized to an agglomeration that serves the largest possible while remaining a still very narrow audience, if that makes any sense. Now, the second thing that I wanted to say, and I think this is actually really important. So the business models are certainly a part of it. The way that technology and software is built is certainly a part of it. The way that network effects are certainly a part of it, are really important. But as well, one of the really interesting things that I found in terms of preparing for this panel was I went sort of back into the UN's records and was looking at the ways in which the concept of freedom of information was conceptualized from a very early period. And in 1946, there was this resolution that was adopted around freedom of expression and freedom of information. And that resolution spoke to this idea that freedom of information requires an indispensable element of the willingness and capacity to employ its privileges without abuse. So we very often talk about these rights in an absolutist term, right? These rights are universal, they are indivisible, they are interdependent, they are rights that we are afforded without any sort of parameters or qualifications on them. But the right to freedom of information, as described at least in this document, requires the use, the access of that right without abuse. And it specifically says that a basic discipline around freedom of information is the moral obligation to seek facts without prejudice and to spread knowledge without malicious intent. And I think that those are two very interesting sort of qualifications that might inform our discussion as we look at, is there a functional capacity to have a right to access to information on the internet today? Can we do so by seeking facts without prejudice? And can we do so without spreading knowledge, without the malicious intent in which we spread knowledge? And I think that second qualification is actually core to the conversation that we're having right now, whether through the sort of structural incentives of platforms or through the intentional perversion of information, both of which are happening at scale.
It's a perfect encapsulation of it's a near perfect encapsulation of the mis and disinformation challenge, right? The structural elements that go into it from a platform, a business model or incentives perspective, or a design and business model perspective, as well as the without malicious intent. Literally the definition of disinformation, spread false information with intent. And so that's an incredibly important point, especially from a rights-based framework. How do you actually balance those things and move them in a direction that achieves scale that you're talking about? Najala, passing over to you for the same question. Is it possible to realize a right for information on the internet today?
My first-year law professor told me that there's only one correct answer to every single question that exists in the world. And that answer is, it depends. It depends. I think under certain conditions, yes. And this is, again, building up of what Catherine and Barbara have said. Look, I'm a political scientist. I focus on disparities of power. And I think one of the big problems that we have right now is that our information ecosystem is characterized by so many disparities of power. And the individual is at the bottom of the totem pole, and governments are next up, and then corporations are at the top. So it would demand a reformulation of those power disparities. And it would also demand of us to accept new frictions in the way in which we relate to the internet. It would give us a slower internet. You think about the impact of the GDPR. A lot of countries in the global majority have websites that are hosted in Europe because it's cheaper, because they're built there, whatever. So like if you're trying to buy a plane ticket, for example, in a national carrier in Kenya, in Ethiopia, you would actually be routed through an European website, which means that you would have to deal with GDPR, which means you have to go through that whole process of checking your cookie preferences and things like that. Now that's an extra friction that slows down the internet as we have been accustomed to using it. But it's a friction that's added with, some thinking towards this right to information, this right to be protected from some of these abuses that come from the corporate power disparity. So are we prepared to accept an internet that has slightly more frictions than what we're accustomed to? Are we prepared to accept an internet whereby, and this again is something that Catherine pointed out, the role of money is diminished? So the internet is no longer primarily a profit-seeking or rent-seeking space, but again, a new commons, a new place where people can build community and can have engagement and have all of these conversations. If we think about Wikipedia, now that it's on the table, it's accepting that asking for money from users every couple of months in order to sort of keep some of the operations going. And I've had that question come up 4 times today alone, just following up on certain topics. But it's something that the frictions slow down the internet as people are accustomed to using it, the algorithm curated internet. But the benefits, the civic benefits that come from that, from having those 300 plus languages, those 10 million plus users participate in that, the rewards from that cannot necessarily be translated into financial terms. And so this ties into, again, what Barbara and Catherine were saying about the role of money. Are we prepared to rethink the role of money in determining how the internet is curated, presented to us, packaged, transmitted around the world? The point that Barbara made about digital infrastructure, the internet as infrastructure, is not a small one. Because again, this is a debate that we're having in the global majority that is really important. Who is going to build the next mile of digital infrastructure? In the first decade of tech optimism in Kenya, I would say probably between 2005 all the way through 2015, it was the government that built the internet infrastructure. It was fiber optic cables. It was all of this really big investment that made Kenya's first digital decade possible. Now the government is retreating from making those infrastructure investments and relying on private companies like Facebook, like Google, to provide, the loon balloons, which failed, to provide all of these free basics, which became problematic for the very same reasons, a curated, curtailed version of the internet. And so that's the question behind the question. Are we prepared to go back to a world whereby the internet was seen as public infrastructure, as a utility, as water, as electricity, as everything, and in which there is a civic responsibility to provide it in a way that thinks about the individual, not just as a consumer, and not just as a budget item, not just as a place where money can be made, but as an individual who has rights and who deserves some kind of protection from the power disparities that come in when money becomes the determining factor, the thing that decides where investments go or where new initiatives go and where new initiatives don't go. And I think this is going to be a really important question moving forward. This is the struggle that we're having. We talk about misinformation and disinformation. Well, in the global majority, this is the struggle that we're having. We're looking at all of this leaks, information coming out about how corporate decisions are impacting political discourse, in Ethiopia, in Myanmar, in all of these countries. That is really at heart these fundamental questions. What was the role in money in determining what investments were made in protecting users and protecting citizens versus protecting the bottom line? And what was the question? What were the infrastructural questions that were made in deciding, well, this place is going to get the full menu of the internet, even if they have to go to search option 500 to get this particular option. And these particular users are going to get a very curtailed, curated version of the internet, a very narrow version of the internet. So to go back to the original formulation, it depends. Are we prepared to be, for the next decade of internet expansion, to be one in which there are slightly more frictions, but the civic rewards are great enough that they justify us absorbing those frictions?
There's such a wealth of knowledge in that answer. One thing that stuck out is a dichotomy that is directly opposite to one of the popular phrases that we hear from one of the world's largest platforms, move fast and break things. And so one of the things where what we're introducing here is friction. Slow down and maybe get it right, or think through the second, third, fourth order consequences before you deploy a new product or deploy a new vehicle to navigate the whole of the internet. And what are the incentives that go along with that? Nanjala, one of the things that you touched on previously is kind of the interconnectedness of this challenge, right? Or the collective challenges that lead to the overall problem. I wonder if you could follow up a little bit on that in particular, and how individual problems or challenges lead into a much broader problem at scale, as well as solutions being collective as well. Because one thing that is absolutely apparent is that we have for better or for worse at this point, a global information environment that includes a number of stakeholders across the board, whether that's absolutely governments and multilateral bodies that governments participate in, of course citizens at the core of it, but also platforms, companies, that don't necessarily fall neatly into our neatly defined legal jurisdictions or go well beyond all of our international borders. And so when we're talking about collective, that's, for me, how that translates into a collective problem of a global information environment. But where do you start with that?
Wow, that's a big question. I think that I always urge us to go back to basics. And I think that's one of the things that this panel is inviting us to do. Let's go back to the basics of what information is, how it flows through the internet, how the internet changes the way information flows through our societies, and how we want it to flow through our societies. And I think that one of the things that's gotten lost in recent years is the basics of what information is supposed to do in our lives, in our public lives. The right to information, as I said before, a recognition that the public sphere is created by discourse, in the broadest sense of the word, that individuals are in constant communication with their governments, with the multilateral bodies, with other entities in the public sphere, and that it's a bilateral thing, that it's not just that we exist to be monetized, to be, handled basically by power, but that we are also present and that we are also in the conversation, and that creates rights and obligations to every single entity that is in the public sphere. I think one of the problems that we've had, again, going back to this blurred distinction between the internet and the platforms that we use to connect to the internet is that the platforms are still operating in a legislative regulatory environment in which they are housed in a very specific, in a country, in a specific jurisdiction, right? And yet creating creating avenues for accessing the internet that are deployed across all kinds of jurisdictions and across all kinds of platforms, and having and having completely different effects, the same thing having completely different effects on different societies because of the contextual political history. So I'll give you an example. The Twitter ban on Donald Trump came a week before a tweet from President Muhammadu Buhari in Nigeria was deleted by Twitter. And it was under the same policy framework that the platform was no longer going to tolerate misinformation being put out by presidents, by people who have power. The same action, the government in Nigeria banned Twitter, the government in the United States, the new government in the United States actually saw it as an advancement, protecting, it's an advancement in democracy because the former president's Twitter account had become a focal point for a great deal of misinformation, especially around the pandemic. Same action, two different political environments, two different outcomes. And the platform itself being a California company, being or Ireland, depending on which entity you're dealing with, being housed in a completely different legislative space. So you see, this is going to become a recurring problem as these 3 billion users stop being young white men, women in California and start being, Amharic speakers from rural Ethiopia and Karen speakers from, Myanmar. And, as the platforms reach that scale that Catherine was talking about, those users are going to continue to be come from completely different places, some places where the people who build the platform can't even find on the map. And so for me, it's always been, well, then go back to the basics. What do we want information to do? Because in every single society, regardless of the political origins, Barbara talks about the origins of some of these universal rights. The vision was that regardless of what system of government you were living in, regardless of what the political history of the society was that you were living in, that information is supposed to play a specific role within that particular polity to make the process of civic discourse, of that formation of the public sphere, more robust, more engaging, to make it possible that the citizen is not at a disadvantage. And I should pause here and say that I'm using the word citizen in the very sort of Athenian democracy, not necessarily to say that people who don't have political citizenship are not represented in this discourse, but is to say, well, what is the fundamentals that we want to get from the internet age? What role do we want information to play in our public lives, not just in the sense of formal governance? One of the best things that has come out of the internet, as Catherine pointed out, is people being able to define community in different ways, that you can have a global community of women who are knitting blankets for children for preemies, and there's 100,000 women from all over the world who are part of this conversation. That's a civic entity. That's a civic entity that's come together with a very specific goal within the public sphere, but they're not bounded by geographical concerns. They're not voting in the same jurisdiction. They're all over the world, different time zones or whatever. And so it's building on that. Okay, we want information to bring these women together to achieve something of representation and to have them be able to articulate themselves before power in a very clear way. That's the vision that I think we need to go back to. It has to serve that purpose in the multiple contexts and multiple histories. And I think, of course, it's much easier said than done. And I would loop it back to my previous point. Are we prepared to do the hard work of building an internet that makes life better, as opposed to resting on the laurels of a version of the internet that we can already see is leading us towards a difficult future?
Well, one of the things that you say there, at least in democracy, is that a right to information is causal, or a causal foundation and a basis for democracy, right? The conception would be You have to have a right to information, or citizens have to have a right to information in order to have a well-informed public, in order to come together and make collective decisions, self-determination. And that's foundational. One of the other components that you picked up on, which I don't think that any number of the little d democracy academics or thinkers were thinking through when they were writing foundational documents and how the scale and scope of the internet would look today, is transparency. Transparency, transparency, transparency. Article 19 has done an enormous amount of work on transparency and specifically platform transparency. So how does, Barbara, this question goes to you, how is transparency and specifically platform transparency foundational to realizing a right to information? And how are those things connected specifically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that when we are talking about transparency, we obviously all say like we need to have transparency of this decision making, but I think it's not just access to, let's say, raw data, because sometimes when you get this information, it needs to be presented in a way that people will make sense out of it, right? So when we talk about transparency in relation to the subject of today's discussion, that is internet or internet infrastructure or internet companies and so on, we need a transparency on many layers, right? So Ninjala spoke about some of the infrastructure issues, which was originally built by the government. Now it's more and more built by the private corporations, often with a partnership with the government or on some licenses from the government. So we need transparency from there. We need to see what the government is paying for, who is getting this contract, on what basis, and so on. And then you have a transparency on the state level, but also on the companies layer. And in terms of the internet or big tech companies, the transparency debates this time focus a lot around the algorithms transparency, right? So that's what we talked earlier about, what sort of algorithms or what sort of decisions are companies making about the content which we see based on certain unknown criteria. But even here, I think that we need to be really kind of mindful of what we are asking for. And I don't even have a problem with something which we call like tiered transparency, because you will have different disclosures to general public or to users, right? So about the content moderation programs or about the procedures and transparency reports which the companies are putting forward, how they profile the content for you, or what sort of content they remove or don't remove on whose request, right? So that's towards the users. But then there is also certain transparency which is probably better just for the regulators. So and here again, like independent regulators, which would be from the public regulatory or social, broader social benefit purposes. And then there is also transparency, which should be for the researchers or for vetted researchers who would be even given access to anonymized data for conducting certain audits or for connection with content moderation programs or personal data and commercial sensitive data. So they would really know how this system works and would be better suited to evaluate them than general public who would be just getting some algorithm which they will not know how to work with it. So transparency is not just like let's get access to everything which it's out there, but really meaningful transparency, right? But Graham, also one thing which we have not really focused on during this discussion is that in terms of internet or in terms of the problems we are discussing in connection to the internet, we often think the problems which we have will be resolved if we address the companies or if we address the technology. But we also actually need to think about the deep underlying problems, for a lack of a better word, offline, which need to be addressed as well if we want to get rid of the problems which we have in terms of like disinformation or other social ills which we see online. Because often the discussion is thinking that the polarized society or these problems is driven by social media or by these companies, God knows what they are doing. But often it's other way around, because we have social inequalities, which we have failed markets, we have economic downturns, and these are actually creating dissatisfied individuals and societies who are then, turning to the disinformation online, and due to economic deprivation, also populists and all kinds of politicians are manipulating this information and are using frustrations in broad segments of the society to manipulate the version of reality which there is, and exploit it for social and political gain. So we really need to also deal with these underlying social problems we have in the society, which then percolate online. But the social media or disinformation and all these issues are more a symptom of these problems than the cause. So we need to deal with those as well.
Thank you so much for that. We're drawing to a close, and I will kick to Catherine for one 1 minute extraordinarily difficult question. We have clearly a lot of work to do and an enormous amount of opportunity that happens to be this week. So this week, we have StratCom on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then on Thursday and Friday of this week, the White House, the Biden administration is hosting the Summit for Democracy, which includes the heads of state of 90 plus countries, any number of other stakeholders, including private industry. And so where do we start in order to protect a right for information or realize a right to information? One line, you get 90 heads of state and a bunch of others. What do we need them to do this week in particular in order to get this right?
Yeah, it's not going to be one line, Grant, but I'll keep it quick. So the answer is we see democratic backsliding all over the world. It's not just in the sort of problematic countries that we see are trending notably authoritarian. It is in established, mature democracies where for the first time in numerous years, we have started to see an actual decrease relative to mature democracies in their democratic participation. So first, we need to acknowledge that. Secondly, I think we can't have it both ways. I think that there is a desire within mature democracies to have strategic ambiguity about how they actually want to approach the internet and whether or not we want to engage in a rights respecting framework. We talk a good game about this, but is a lack of a clear sort of policy directive, particularly within the United States, within the level of this administration or prior administrations, about the kind of internet that we want to see and whether or not that wants to be rights respecting. And I think that strategic ambiguity, while understanding it from the perspective of realpolitik and protecting commercial interests, is ceding ground to authoritarian visions of the internet and a carved up world that will result in an internet that does not respect human rights because we lack a clear vision for what a rights respecting internet should be. So what we need coming out of this summit, or at least for this summit to recognize and then create space for, and I actually prefer the latter, for this summit to recognize and create space for, is a recognition that a rights-respecting vision of the internet is something that matured and emerging democracies needs to coalesce around if that is the type of internet that we want to live on for the next decade or decades to come. And that means a clear policy approach that is comprehensive and holistic, that looks across the various different considerations that go into this diverse ecosystem that is wildly owned by different stakeholders, that brings these stakeholders together around a set of core values that are grounded in human rights, open protocols and principles, and invests in existing vehicles and the multi-stakeholder fora that have long governed the internet to ensure that they are revitalized, invested in, and can become the places for the continued conversation around what kind of internet that we want to have. So that's where I would leave it.
That's an enormously succinct answer. Catherine, Nanjala, Barbara, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time this morning to kick off StratCom with this conversation. I think it's a really, really good frame for conversations to come, both at StratCom and, as we just discussed, the Summit for Democracy. With that, we're going to close. The next session is actually related to this. It is Tech Ambassadors and Digital Foreign Policy, moderated by Rachel Gillum, the head of global policy in the Office of Ethical and Humane Use of Technology at Salesforce. I hope you'll tune into that conversation, and thanks again for joining us to kick off StratCom.